So I've been researching the field of human trafficking for quite some time. And it seems that there's been this odd trend that started around 2016 to 2018 to get pornography, pornographic materials, and pornographic production as labeled as human trafficking. Now, the people advocating this, generally speaking, you can't go deep in terms of researching them. You'll ask them how it is, and they'll just say it is, and they'll do some power sloganing. I have a really good example of this, of two ladies who are passionate against exploitation, especially of minors. Let me just listen to this.
What fuels sex trafficking, specifically child sex trafficking? The answer is pornography. Yes, all forms of pornography, even what is sometimes referred to as so-called ethical pornography. Pornography is fueling the sex trafficking and child sex trafficking industry.
By accepting the status quo, like Aristotle, and denying the causal relationship, like the tobacco companies, we also contribute to the slavery of 27 million people. If you still think your orgasm is worth the price being paid for it, which you're completely free to do, at least own it. Be aware. Don't be a hypocrite.
Okay, but what did they really lay down there in terms of providing any information on how these trends are linked? And that last lady, the one who did the TED Talk, honestly, she seemed to not think it was that bad. It's like, okay, just engage in this and, just have no shame or hypocrisy. Just acknowledge it. I don't get that. So I was watching the show Trigonometry, and they had a pornographic actress, Eva Lovia, who made actually a profound observation that many countries, porn is outright banned. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that doesn't mean that pornographic content doesn't make it into those countries, but we should see a trend of, if porn is responsible for human trafficking, where porn is illegal, you'd have less of a problem with human trafficking. And so I thought of this would be very interesting, and this is going to be like part one of maybe a 2 or 3 part series. So the first thing I did was note which countries banned pornography. Now, I got this from a list that is not very definitive, but what you should see is countries are ranked by our State Department and put into publication in the Trafficking in Persons report. It's the tool we have to best analyze human trafficking. Doesn't mean it's perfect, but hey, if you're a researcher like me, you got to dance with the girl that brought you. And essentially, countries are put into 4 tiers. Tier 1 means compliance with the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. In other words, a country that's better at addressing human trafficking. Now, due to population size, like a country with 1 billion people, even if they're compliant, probably going to have more people trafficked than, say, a small, tiny island nation. But it's, what are you doing about it? Then there's Tier 2, not quite Tier 1. Now, this is where things maybe get a bit complicated. There's Tier 2 watch list, and then there's Tier 3. And Tier 2 watch list means be careful or we're going to put you into Tier 3. Tier 3 often recognized as the worst. So I actually put these into a spreadsheet, and I would think that where porn was illegal, you would see nothing but Tier 1 countries, provided that there's some truth to this, with an outlier. And you can see my numbers over here. Don't be intimidated by these, but basically what this breaks down to is the fact that at face value, there's no relationship going on here. Now, in my next video, I'm going to get way further into this. But yeah, the fact that you don't even have a single Tier 1 country on the list is, to me, just remarkable. So make of that what you will. This is part 2, and this video focuses on correlation and publication. So correlation is pretty simple. If we see, do we observe a relationship between 2 factors? And this is being done because, like I said, I've often heard that there's a link between pornography and human trafficking, but I've never met anybody who seems to be able to prove so or has done a good research on the topic. And so that always worries me when you have a piece of information that just flies. So correlation is very easy to do on a spreadsheet, and I'm going to show you that. And also I'm going to talk about publication. I'm going to look up some very respected publications, and I'm going to see if they mention this. Now I want to be very clear that, this video, the spirit of it, and the previous one, this is research. I'm not going to try to tell you who to vote for or how you should feel about the industry, but at the end I'm going to recommend some great books to read, regardless of which side of this aisle you're on. So let me explain to you how I came up with an idea to test correlation. So if you read the Trafficking in Persons report, there's about 4 sections and 3 tiers. There's Tier 1, which means your country is doing a lot to keep up with the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. Tier 2 means you're not quite doing that well. And there's a subsection called Tier 2 Watch List. I just combined the two. And then there's Tier 3, which the State Department has basically said you're not doing anything to comply with TVPA, and you're one of the worst countries for human trafficking. So I ranked countries according to what their stance on pornography was. Do they pretty much have no restrictions, providing, of course, stuff like the children and animals? So, unrestricted, somewhat restricted. In other words, maybe it can be purchased but not produced. And then finally, where it's just outright banned as a crime. So, what I did was I assigned a numeric value that was in line with 1, 2, and 3. I figured Tier 1 countries, I figured countries that had the ban, of course, should be Tier 1 countries, right? Because if there's a link, and if pornography is completely illegal, and you should basically have a reduced trafficking. Now, that's not the most perfect logic, and I understand that even the numbers that you get from countries, because this is on the internet and people use proxies, so who knows. So, and then I figured if your country has unrestricted, it's got to be Tier 3, so it's assigned the number 3. Of course, if it's restricted in some ways, but not completely illegal, that would go with 2. And finally, where it is completely banned, I figured to give a value of 1. Now, I'm going to actually show you the spreadsheet here. A simple spreadsheet. You've got 3 sections. You've got country, tier. You have legality status. I'm just going to scroll to the bottom here. And you know what? Let me make that much bigger so that you can see it more prominently, especially if you're doing this from like a smartphone device. And there you have it, a negative correlation between porn legality status and human trafficking. Yeah, I don't really understand why there would be a negative correlation. But either way, this seems to prove that there's not much truth to this. At least using the method I did, but I can't really think of another method. Also, I dived into the publication, and I looked at the Trafficking in Persons report. And I went back, I think, the last 7 years, and essentially just did, Command F and searched to see if any of these trafficking in person reports mentioned pornography. None did in the last 7 years. So that's about as far as I'm really going to look into this issue. I mean, it seems to me that this has been a dead end. Some people might find it fascinating that there's a negative correlation. A lot of things could perhaps explain for that. It's, numbers don't behave the way you would expect them to. Coming into this, you'd think it'd be positive or maybe 0 but negative. Okay, that was a bit strange. But then again, we're talking countries, so only 158 of them, that's going to affect the data, versus if we're looking at 10,000 or something. Now, I'm going to move on to the next section and briefly just mention some books that if you're somebody who has strong opinions about the pornographic industry, specifically if you have strong opinions against it, this is some great literature, and I've read all 3 of these myself. Pornography and Genocide, The War Against Women. Definitely a lot of political hyperbole in this book, and it gets into the idea of commissioned rape tapes, which has never been proven, but still a fascinating read. The Pornography Industry, What Everyone Needs to Know. Ambitious title because everyone doesn't need to know about pornography. But think of this as a sort of Ask Me Anything book, the stuff you were too embarrassed to ask or didn't want to admit you didn't know. And finally, Only Words by all-time great Catherine A. McKinnon, a legend in the field of feminism, if you're interested in that. I tell people to read this book not necessarily just for the arguments, well, actually, not just for the anti-pornography argument, but just in how to structure argument. Catherine McKinnon is equal parts scholar, but also equal parts attorney and wants to win. And I think there's a lot of people out there who do themselves a disservice by letting their skills of persuasion and rhetoric not really develop.